So as a performer on Broadway film and television, when it comes to the Blake Lively controversy, I was really interested in knowing the specifics about what made her uncomfortable with Justin Baldoni, other than just all of these nebulous accusations. And so now we have more information, and I want to tell you my thoughts on it. Stick with me here because this is going to be a rather long analysis. Quote the article here real quick. Sources with direct knowledge tell TMZ, there was a scene in which Justin lifts Blake into the air. According to our sources, Justin has a history of back problems, and before lifting Blake, he went to his on-set trainer and asked how much he weighed and how he could train to protect his back from injury. Blake later found out about Justin's comment and felt that he fat-shamed her. I'm going to refer to my notes, so bear with me. This is kind of what I mean when I talk about mean girls weaponizing faux feminism, right? Because what she just described is not fat shaming. Fat shaming would actually be waiting till after you do a scene that you know requires a degree of physicality that you might struggle with, to then go on and shame that person unnecessarily. Because here's the thing, I dance professionally on Broadway, and however inconvenient it may be, sometimes there will be sensitive situations where a male dancer is struggling with a lift. And my point is that it truly doesn't matter if the dancer is overweight or not. That is irrelevant, because the fact of the matter is he's struggling regardless. And without projecting unnecessary shame onto a situation that is inherently neutral, you simply problem solve. That's what you got to do, which will be modifying the lift. And sometimes, yes, working with the male dancer to strength train, depending on how much time you have. So while it is an understandable thing to be sensitive about, you cannot take it personally. It would be so unprofessional for a Broadway actor to accuse someone of fat shaming in this exact same situation. I'm just saying. So it is a battle of the PR teams, but if we're interested in seeing a contextual pattern arise, there is a viral clip of her and Parker Posey going around doing press for a Woody Allen movie that's problematic enough in itself. That's a wildly uncomfortable watch, where the interviewer basically compliments her baby bump, and Blake responds by basically insulting her by saying, "I like your little bump." The interviewer was not pregnant. Even though the pregnancy was already announced and it was obviously meant as a compliment, she wasn't outing her pregnancy and she wasn't touching her belly, but we're seeing a possible pattern here for heightened sensitivity to what should be neutral situations. Best, a lack of media training. I also really want to point out that in that interview, she again demonstrates what many perceive as faux feminism by asking, I wonder if they would ask men these questions about the clothes. But what's ironic is that that's all she wants to talk about when it comes to It Ends With Us, like wear your florals and stuff. Also, not only was the interviewer known for writing about fashion and clothing, but the movie that she was interviewing Blake about was a period piece. So yes, that is actually the perfect time to ask about costumes and clothing. She was offended at a reporter asking an entirely appropriate question about costume pieces, but when it comes to a piece about domestic violence, the clothing is all she wants to talk about. It's really more about the pattern of selective outrage here than anything else. But here's the more interesting stuff. Her other main point of proof of Justin being borderline abusive and making her uncomfortable was that he lingered too long on a kiss. Now, the reason this is interesting is because since they are both pretending, because it's acting, who is to determine what too long is? And remember, intimacy coaches were present for filming. Also, I've already made a video talking about how I think Blake Lively is a really great natural performer on camera, but not necessarily a transformative actor per se. But I will say this, okay? When I was on Broadway, quite often the ones that identified less as serious actors and more as dancers or singers were the ones that felt more uncomfortable when it came to having to rehearse or perform darker and heavier material. And make no mistake, performers should always feel safe when they're performing, but not even the safest of work environments can automatically completely eradicate a certain amount of discomfort that, to no fault of one's own, someone might not be accustomed to if they're not trained for it. And yes, I have seen numerous instances of both men and women performers who didn't identify as actors first struggle with the vulnerable nature of rehearsing heavy, dark materials to the degree that they would find certain situations weird, that were actually indeed professional, albeit uncomfortable. Does that make sense? Here's the tricky thing, right? Performers should always feel safe. And I'm not saying that Blake didn't actually feel uncomfortable. I'm not invalidating her truth, because no one should have to do something they're not comfortable doing. However, sometimes just because you are uncomfortable, it doesn't automatically mean that the other person is unprofessional. That's just not how it works. It might just mean that, to no fault of your own, you don't have the comfort level necessary, the bandwidth necessary to handle such sensitive material, because that's exactly what makes acting so tricky. And sometimes we'll never know who's right. That's why intimacy coaches are so important. Actors should never have to consciously dig into their own trauma to access emotions, okay? We're getting into some really deep conversations about the nature of acting being autobiographical and like if that's necessary, because if it's truly so based on your own personal trauma, then it's not acting, right? But acting is so much more collaborative than people realize. It's actually so much more about your partner and living in the truth of what that moment and what that scene partner is giving you. Whether we're talking Stanislavski, whether we're talking Meisner, whatever methods, quite often the reality of the uncomfortable nature of your scene partners in their character's energy is something you often can actually use to fuel the scene, not necessarily back away from, because you're projecting your own personal discomfort into the work. And yes, again, we're all going to have our opinions, but my point is the pattern that we're seeing here, just me personally, even with the It Ends With Us press tour, is one of shying away from acknowledging the heavier aspects of the movie, you know, wearing florals, you know, you're more than just a survivor, which is actually truly so minimizing and reductive to people, including myself, that this movie is supposed to be for. Not to mention being objectively rude when asked how people who have been affected by the movie's themes might want to talk to her. She ridicules fans for being seemingly boundary pushing and obsessed, like, oh, do you want my location shared? When that was not the question being asked. And again, the performative disconnect is a little disturbing. Okay, and lastly, I just want to say this. When it comes to the cast seeming to support Blake and not Justin, although interestingly enough, I have not confirmed this, you have to research yourself, but apparently the crew did not unfollow Justin, which I find very telling. I just want to remind people of how very powerful the mean girl behavior can be. Like, we're all still stuck in high school. You never really leave, especially in industries. Blake and Ryan are a machine, and we all know people who aren't celebrities even are capable of twisting and mutating their own narrative of truth. It happens all the time. And again, the point here being, if you have been on tours or sets or companies for extended periods of time that perform, the pressure to survive, to get that next job is real. It is a very insecure industry, I would know. The point is that being on Taylor Swift's best friend's good side is not to be underestimated. So much of the industry is about networking and being on the good side of producers and agents. That's how you get jobs a lot of times, word of mouth. And especially if you're personally familiar with the content of this film, then you're also aware of how people do things and take sides all the time to survive. That just because people willingly did things like unfollow somebody or whatever doesn't mean that they didn't feel incredibly coerced for the sake of job survival. I'm just telling you, especially as a minority that had to grapple with some of my own moral dilemmas when I was accepting certain roles and doing certain things in the industry. The pressure to embed yourself for career safety, and honestly, sometimes just because certain people are just thirsty, right? Like they need that validation. It's not to be underestimated. And of course, tomorrow we could get actual proof of more actual abuse from Justin on set. But I do think it's a little odd that as of right now, after all this is what Blake's team is offering as proof of borderline abusive behavior, because I was really curious as an actor for more specific examples of like the unprofessionalism. And even before this article came out, I really felt like it was just going to have something to do with a certain amount of discomfort, guardedness, sensitivity around the idea of self that Blake has, because it's not that actors can't be insecure about things, but the point is to channel that into the work, not project that onto your scene partner and your idea of what unprofessionalism is on set. Context is so important in everything. It defines everything, but especially situations like this. As a domestic abuse survivor myself, I talk a lot on this channel about, you know, my narcissistic, terrible ex-husband who actually tried to kill me. That's like the thing that actually made me leave. I take allegations like this extremely seriously, especially from the perspective of understanding how important reputation is in the industry. But as of right now, from a professional standpoint, taking in the context of everything, none of this seems unprofessional to me. But accusing your scene partner, yes, your coworker, of being abusive and unprofessional on set because you felt like they lingered too long in a kiss, it's tricky. And I just think that the irony here is not lost on a lot of people. For so long, we felt so comfortable throwing out these very nebulous, casual accusations of being abusive and being unprofessional and making people uncomfortable on set, while completely minimizing and reducing or even acknowledging any of the actual dark themes that the movie is actually about. Feeling fat shamed is not the same thing as being fat shamed. In the same way that when I talk about emotional intelligence, being safe is not the same thing as feeling safe, you know? Or lived personal reality of something is always going to be in the feeling of something, right? Because as I talk about a lot when we talk about autistic accommodations and nervous system regulations, for all intents and purposes, there are many times when you actually are safe and you even know that intellectually, but that does not mean that you feel safe. And the same goes for handling especially dark material on sets in these very unnatural, intimate situations with actors that takes a lot of trust, first of all. And my point is that existing within the paradox of how all of these different realities and truths overlap and coexist is part of the work. You don't necessarily have to invalidate the reality and the truth of how Blake claims that she felt. You also acknowledge that two things can be true at the same time, which kind of brings me back to my original video thesis that I made the other day, which is, what is acting then? Because just from an objective standpoint, these are very nebulous proof of evidence and accusations to be made that do honestly kind of reek of hypersensitivity, which is only especially ironic because the same grace that she is expecting to receive from the public and sympathy is also the same grace and sympathy she is not extending towards people wanting her to address the heavier aspects of the material. So one could say, you're more than just a survivor and you'll be fine. I don't know.